Hey y'all, Big Tim here again. Thanks for tuning in for another episode of Old School and Bass with Big Tim. Today we're going to talk about something pretty special to me, and that's soft plastics. I used to say that, well, a particular soft plastic that I'm holding here in my hand attributed to more fish catches than everything else combined. And that's really not true. I started thinking about, different top waters and different crankbaits and throw it all together. No, I don't think so. But it is definitely attributed to more fish catches than any other lure. That's the baby brush hog. I've caught more fish on this than any other lure. Okay, this is the baby brush hog. This is green pumpkin, and that's the one that I have on the majority of the time. Probably about 75 to 80% of the time, I'll have one tied on. These work real good when the bite's tough and you need something subtle. These are pretty subtle. A lot of times I'll fish this behind guys that are fishing a shaky head, which we're going to talk about later, and still catch fish after the guys with the shaky head have gone through and not caught fish. Now, part of that is the way I work it. We'll get into that in another episode. Stay tuned for that one. That's going to be called, what are we calling that one? Brush Hog Confessions. And then we're going to have another episode called the Brush Hog Beatdown, where me and a friend of mine are going to go out and just throw brush hogs and see who's the king. But anyway, baby brush hog, green pumpkin. I pair it with a 4/0 trocar hook. I usually have a 1/4 ounce weight tied on, but you can go anywhere from an 1/8 ounce, 3/16, and a quarter. I almost always have a quarter on. I generally have, there's not generally, I always have tungsten tied on anymore. Tungsten is quite expensive, so some of you guys may not want to do that. If you want to use lead, by all means, go for lead. It just adds a little bit more profile to the bait. But if you're going to use lead, make sure you're using a painted lead sinker. Doesn't matter if it's black or green pumpkin as long as it's not silver. You will catch more fish if you're not using a silver. Okay? And I may do an episode to show you how to paint your own sinkers once it gets warmer. So, again, if I'm flipping and pitching, I use a 4/0 trocar hook. You can use a 2/0 and you can use a 3/0. Okay? They'll work too, but I got into this for tournament mode. I wanted the biggest bite that I could have on a hook. So 4/0 works well for flipping and pitching. If I Carolina rig this guy, which I do a lot, I will put a 4/0 EWG extra wide gap hook. Okay? So by comparison, and I do throw what I call the full-size brush hog, but the package just says brush hog. This is the baby brush hog. Okay, a little bit smaller. This is very similar. I use this in situations where I'm looking for bigger fish. This guy right here, if I'm flipping it, I'm putting it on putting a 5/0 trocar round bend or a 5/0 EWG if I'm Carolina rigging it. So as far as colors go, you can keep it as simple or as difficult as you want. If you want to keep it simple, green pumpkin is, like I said, on there 75 to 80% of the time. Another color that I do real well with in the spring, basically from about February till the fish come off the nest, and that is pumpkin, standard pumpkin. It's kind of a brownish color. Dad always says it looks pink to him, but he didn't like it when he got stomped with the pink bait, but it happens. And that one really works well because I think it resembles the way crayfish look when they come out of hibernation and when they're molting. So remember pumpkin. Really works well on a blue sky day, and the water's fairly clear to, 1.5 feet of visibility. And while we're talking colors and watercolor, that's what I like to do. I like to try to match the watercolor. Green pumpkin is my number one. Pumpkin is probably number two. Number three, if I'm working in a clear water situation, some variation of watermelon, whether it's watermelon candy, standard watermelon, watermelon violet in a really clear water situation. Those are my three staples, and then one more for when I'm dealing with dirty water. Actually, two more. Junebug and or blueberry. Blueberry is kind of a black and blue flake. Junebug is more of a purple, with some green in it, and they work well in dirty water situations. If you just want to have 2 or 3 colors of brush hogs, or any soft plastics for that matter, look at green pumpkin, look at a watermelon and or pumpkin, and then look at something dark like a June bug or blackberry. Okay, those would be your uh, colors to think about. This one happens to be blue fleck. It's another good dark watercolor. Okay, another bait that's very similar. Oh, before I do that, wanted to talk about, I had it sitting right there so I didn't forget it, and I almost did. A lot of times I'll put this little rattle in this baby brush hog, especially when the bites get tough. And I'll put it right in that general vicinity, so between the hook point and the curve of the hook. And you can put that in there and put it in a bush, rattle it around, and the fish will come to it. It doesn't make a real loud rattle. I mean, this is only a 2 millimeter thing with tiny, tiny little BBs in it. I don't know if you can hear it or not. But that's one of my little secrets of a brush hog. Another bait that I use a lot, I'll have one of these tied on a lot as well, right next to a brush hog. This is a Zoom Ultra Vibe Speed Crawl. These really work well when the fish are a little bit more actively feeding. These are a great little bait. You can use them a multitude of ways. They work good as a jig trailer. You can Texas rig them. You can Carolina rig them. You can wind them in. I've used them on swim jigs. Again, colors, just like we said, green pumpkin, pumpkin, watermelon, June bug, black and blue, something along in those colors. And now, since we are old school, we're going to talk about the old school tube. This is a small little river tube. I don't even think this company is in existence anymore. Hard to find. This is a little 3-inch tube, and it's real thin. Most of the tubes that you're going to find these days are the 4-inch flipping tubes. They're a little bit bigger around, normally about big around as your thumb. But you can see this guy's a lot thinner than my thumb. So for these guys, I generally like to Texas rig them. If you go up north, you can, or if you're fishing in open water, you can use a jig head and have the hook sticking out. But if you're doing heavy flipping, you'll want to Texas rig it. And you just Texas rig that like you would any other bait. There is a big difference in a tube and a brush hog. Obviously, it's hollow. There's a couple different things you can do. You can put earplugs in there and put scent in there, so there's always a scent trail. You can also put a little bigger rattle in there. Okay? You put that thing in there, and the sound actually is amplified by the tube itself. And if you're doing some heavy flipping, and let's say the water's muddy. I mean, muddy. A black and blue tube with this rattle is one of the best bets that you can do. You can throw it in there, put it in that bush, shake it a couple times, pause it, let it wait, throw it, shake it again, pause it, and the fish will find that bait. They really will. They will come actively seeking what that noise is and eat that bait. So keep that in mind on some of those muddy water conditions. Another one of my favorite creature style baits is the Reaction Innovations Beaver. Now there's a lot of companies out there. Well, all of these baits that we talked about, there's a lot of companies making a lot of variations. But I like the Reaction Innovations. This one is actually called a hematoma color. This is what I call the full-size beaver, but they call it the Sweet Beaver 420. This is the original size. This is what I use the majority of the time. This is the Smalley Beaver. You can see by comparison, it's a lot smaller. But that's not why it's called a Smalley Beaver. It's called a Smalley Beaver because it was made to catch smallmouth bass versus largemouth. You'll see I almost always have the tails split. For this one here, I generally put a 4/0 EWG hook on it. It's a little beefier, so I want to have a little bit more bite on my hook. For these little guys here, I'm using a 2/0 or even sometimes a 1/0 EWG. The problem with those small hooks like that, the 1/0 and 2/0, is most of the time they have such a thin wire diameter that the hooks bend real easily. So I have found a new hook. Who knows? I might convert everything to this hook. The hooks I showed you earlier were trocars. For this little guy right here, I really like using a Berkeley Fusion hook. They're really good sharp hooks. They're a little heavier wire diameter, and they don't bend as easily. I really, really like them on smallie beavers. This one's green pumpkin. Again, always a mainstay. This little color here that I'm not going to tell you the name, you can find that out yourself. This is a Lake Cumberland killer. Dale Hollow, any place it's clear water. Okay? Like I said, you can find the name yourself, but I'm not going to say it here. The cool thing about these smallie beavers, or even the big beaver, you can use these a variety of different ways. You can flip them and pitch them. You can use them as jig trailer. I don't think I've ever Carolina rigged one of these, but why not? And of course, I don't have one out here to show you, but Tommy Biffle has his from Jean LaRue. Very similar to a beaver, except it's got a hollow chamber in it. And he fishes that offshore with a swing head, which we're going to talk about that in another episode. Here's the Zoom version of a beaver. This is a Z-Crawl. This is a junior model. And again, you can do the same thing with it. You can Texas rig it. You can use it as jig trailer. All different kinds of things. I know right now somebody's screaming, "Hey, this is supposed to be old school. I didn't forget about you." The lizard. This is an old school bait, just like the tube. This is all we used to use back in the 80s, 90s, early 90s. This is a 6-inch green pumpkin Zoom lizard. You know, you can get 4 inches, which that was my dad's favorite. He'd catch a lot of fish on that guy, but they were always small fish. When the bite was tough, he was tough with that little 4-inch lizard. But you can bite in a 5-inch, you can bite in a 6-inch, and you can bite in an 8-inch lizard. And a lot of guys will throw that 8-inch lizard on a Carolina rig. Well, a lot of guys still throw a 6-inch lizard on a Carolina rig too. But lizards really work well, particularly in the spring, because when bass are spawning, they search out those lizards and eat them, because lizards, salamanders, newts, whatever you want to call them, the rumor has it they eat bass eggs. Well, I've never seen one eating a bass egg, but that's what they say, so it's got to be true, right? Anyway, those are lizards. So another soft plastic that we can use. This is generally used for topwater situations, okay? And I chose this color so it would show up real nice on the camera. This is a Zoom horny toad. And generally you put a 5/0 hook through the center of this and you reel it across. It's a topwater. And this is good to use in situations where you have a lot of moss or heavy cover or something like that. But you can also use it as a swim jig trailer. You can also use it as a buzz bait body. There's a lot of guys using it as a buzz bait. Really works well for that. Another one that you can Texas rig, you can use as a jig trailer. They really work nicely. This is the Rage, well actually this is the Baby Rage Crawl. This is the first one I grabbed. We got Baby Rage Crawl, and Rage Lobster. They're all basically the same thing, just different sizes. They've got these little these little claws. I don't know if you can see it right there, but they're cupped so they'll kick water as they swim. Really nice. I love using these as a jig trailer, and occasionally I'll Texas rig them. So this is one I was really reluctant to let out of the bag, but I'm not really tournament fishing anymore, so it doesn't make that big of a difference. This bait right here really does well when the fish are on the bed or about to be. Okay, this is called the Gambler Flappin' Shad. And it's a lot like a fluke, and it works like a fluke. But when you split that tail like I have, because they come with the tail all together, when you split the tail like I did there, you reel that across the top of the water, and it sounds like a buzz bait. You know, Zoom makes a speed worm that basically has the same style tail on it. And you could probably use it the same way, reeling it across the top of the water. But this one has a little bit more buoyancy to it, so you can use it like a fluke. Except I've used flukes and I've used this. The flapping shad will call out big fish in clear water situations and bedding situations. If you look and you think there should be a bed there, but you can't find that fish, if you throw this, you may not catch the fish on it, but she will show herself. This is a great search bait. Okay? I didn't bring any flukes out to show you. That's because I'm going to do another episode about the donkey rig. Everybody always is amazed when I talk about the donkey rig. Even guys at work, guys that have been fishing for years and years and years, never knew it. I want to get in the swimming pool and show you that, but we will eventually. So another popular and easy to use bait is the stickworm. Okay? Yamamoto started the craze with the Senko. And Yamamotos are incredible baits. Let me tell you, if you think that you're going to throw them wacky style, which a wacky style is when you hook them right in the middle. Right in the middle. They sink and they're kind of undulating like that. Not that extremely, because obviously, you know, the air and the water are thicker, but as they're sinking, they're undulating just like that, and it drives fish crazy. But I will tell you, the Yamamotos will have the best action of any of the stickworms if you're trying to do the wacky rig. If you're going to Texas rig, like I do a lot, you know, you can use some of the cheaper ones. Because Yamamotos are pretty expensive. They're about $8 a bag, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. Whereas like the Yum Dingers, I think they're $2.99 a bag. But you'll notice the Yum Dingers are a lot stiffer. They're not going to have the same action that that guy has. So you can Texas rig it like we did anything else. And then in that case, I'll use a 2, 3, or 4/aught round bend hook for a 5-inch. I like a 5-inch anywhere I'm fishing for 15-inch fish or better. 4-inch is what I'm going to use a lot of times on the river. The mighty Ohio here, where the bite's tough and the fish are small. So one thing I get asked about a lot at work is the wacky rig and how I do it. Well, here's an O-ring, and I don't have an actual O-ring tool per se, but what I did was I took an old ink pen apart, and it's hollow. And what I do is I put that ring right on there, and you slide it down. Kind of difficult to do on camera. So what ends up happening is you put the Senko or stickworm inside that hollow body. Then you slide. I don't know if you can see it there. I'm still sliding it up the bait till it will fall on the stickworm. Boom. There it is, already on there. So now all we have to do is take our hook, and I'm going to use a big hook. I'm going to use this one that I use for a brush hog just to show you. And you just barely go under that O-ring. And there's your wacky rig. But if you want to Texas rig it, you know, depending on what size sinker you want, if you Texas rig this dude, it's just like anything else. Right down the center, come out a 1/4 inch, twist it around, and then put it back in the bait. If you're fishing around heavy cover when you Texas rig, make sure that hook point isn't poking out at all. If you're not around heavy cover, you can do what they call Texpose and have it come out a little bit. So that happens to be that 4/aught hook. Works real well. Okay? One thing we forgot to talk about when we talked about Texas rig, particularly the brush hog. I almost always, when I am flipping and pitching my brush hog, have it on a sinker stop or a bobber stop. I call them a BB. This little yellow thing is a bobber stop. You put those on your line, and that keeps your sinker from sliding around. So if you don't go over a branch, it doesn't fall off and come away from the hook, so you'll get hung up. I almost always have one. I rarely use the yellows. Black and red is what I use majority of the time. The yellows I just save for, You know, if I'm just going goofing off, I'll use yellow. But I believe in red, particularly if I'm using a green pumpkin style bait or a pumpkin. And if I'm using black bait or dark bait, I'll use a black BB or bobber stop. Those are nice and handy. They pretty simple. They come in a package like this. This one's been well used. I don't know if you can see. There's a whole, circle or a ring there. And you just put your line up through there and then pull your BB on. And now we have 2 on our lure. Okay. So now we're into worms. And I use a lot of different style worms. A lot of times here on the river we use 4-inch worms or 7-inch worms. This happens to be a curly tail worm. This is a 3/16 ounce. And you can see I've got that black BB on there like we just talked about. Okay. That keeps your sinker pegged up close to the worm. And that's what it is. It's basically to peg your worm. Okay, this is black with a white tail, good for river fishing. I'll also use like a 4-inch ringtail. Curly tail worm, ribbon tail worm, some people call them. There's also like a shaky head worm. We'll use a straight tail worm. I pulled pink out just so you could see it a little easier. Again, your colors on these are going to be green pumpkin and watermelon and everything we talked about already. But the reason I brought pink was so we can see it. And we can also talk about pink and white are also good when you just Texas rig them with no weight. You can use that as almost kind of a top water. Kind of like the same as what we talked about with the flapping shad. Now I'm going to put a bigger hook in here than I would ever use, but it was handy. With no sinker, if you twitch this, it'll stay on the surface or just below. And fish will come and find it, especially in clear water situations. Pink and white. And one other color called methylate, which is this. Floating worm technique, really, really fun. Shaky head. You know, shaky head is something that a lot of people use when a tournament bite gets really, really tough. Some guys, that's all they throw. But for me, it's something that if I'm going to do it, it better be really tough out. And there are other situations when maybe it's not quite so tough, but you're dealing with bigger fish. This is a 10-inch straight, actually a flapping tail worm on a big old hook. I've caught a lot of fish on this one at Kentucky Lake. That's, I think that's a 1/2 ounce weight on a 10-inch worm. Plum is always a great color on the TVA. Any of the lakes on the Tennessee River, plum is something to consider. I also like plum big worms. Here's a 10-inch and here's a 12-inch. Again, plum. Actually, one of them looks like it's blue fleck. Plum and blue fleck are very similar. For this guy right here, I believe this is a 7/0 extra wide gap hook. And I'll generally put it on a 1/2 ounce tungsten weight, maybe a 3/8. I don't peg these weights because if you're fishing open water, you shouldn't need them. I actually saw a seminar one time where Shaw Grigsby was talking about when to peg and when not to peg. And he said Larry Nixon told him never peg. Well, I don't agree with that because if you're fishing heavy cover, I'm always pegged. But as far as open water, what ends up happening is when the worm is sinking, this peg is generally out in front of it, or the sinker is generally out in front of the worm, and it looks like the worm is chasing the sinker to eat it. So that kind of fires those fish up. So the 12-inch worm I generally put on a 7/0 Trokar EWG, and the 10-inch worm, which we use, I mean, a lot of people use them for pond fishing. But the 10-inch worm, I generally use a 5/0 round bend or EWG if I'm out in open water. So the last thing I want to talk about is one of the latest crazes, And this is where I would suggest a lot of people think, if you've never gotten involved in soft plastics, this might be the way for you to do it. And that is the Ned Rig. Okay. Z-Man is a company that kind of is the standard bearer as far as the Ned Rig situation. Their soft plastic is made out of something called 3X. And you can see it stretches. It doesn't break. And the other thing is it floats straight up and down. So this is the Finesse TRD. And what you do is you kind of put it on a jig head. Now this one is going to be better suited for some place that doesn't have a lot of hang-ups, because it's going to be an open jig head. So I didn't put this one on very good. But that's kind of the gist of it. Push it up on the jig head a little better. Okay, this little guy right here. Just throw it down and let it hit bottom and work it back. Now, like I said, this one isn't weedless, so you're going to get hung up a little bit with it. There are different models out there that have different weed guards on them you might want to consider. But I think if you're just getting into soft plastics and you want to start dragging, something on the bottom to get your get some familiarity with what bites feel like and what the bottom contours feel like and everything else, this might be the place to start. You are going to catch a bunch of fish. They may not be giants, but you'll catch a bunch of fish with it. By comparison, this is the Finesse TRD, and that's the standard TRD. This is 4-inch, and I think this is like 2.5. But both are the 3X material. Like I said, they will float straight up and down. The sinker will be on the bottom, and that'll get you a lot of bites. So I think that's pretty much it about soft plastics. I think we've covered almost everything. I'm sure there's some things we forgot about. If I forgot about your favorite bait, I'm sorry. We may cover it in another episode. But again, leave me a question down at the bottom. Give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. Actually, I hope you learned a lot. And I know you don't want to share this with your buddies because you want to be able to outfish them. But if you can share this with your buddies and they subscribe, the more subscribers I get, the more information I can drop. So tune in, and thanks for stopping in. We'll talk to you again. Thanks.